When I landed in Brussels on Monday, a huge banner greeted me at the airport. It read, "Use your vote. European elections, June 2024. So I must ask you, when did you vote in favor of mass migration? When did you vote for a party that openly said, we will open the borders, we will change our societies, we will deconstruct our culture, your past will be a different country? Because I can't recall ever casting such a vote, and chances are neither have you. Migration was supposed to be a temporary event, a temporary solution to labor shortages. It was supposed to be temporary, but we all know that temporary fixes are the most durable solutions. It was all based on the guest worker, Gastarbeiter premise. You will come, you will earn, and you will return. Yet, the modern equivalent to Veni Vidi Vici never worked as planned. Or maybe it did. They came, they saw, and they most definitely conquered. It turned out that no one is coming back, that the Europeans need to embrace the brave new world of multicultural societies, open borders, and the future where certainly Islam is a part of their heritage. Luigi Barzini, a great patriot of One Europe, wrote in his Prologue to Europeans, a book I do encourage you to read. I quote here, "We recognize our common homeland everywhere, in the noisy streets of towns, in the smiling faces of children, the elderly people, in neat bourgeois houses with polished floors and shiny windows, in the dancing steps of girls, the majestic flow of great rivers, flowing their waters by the forest-covered banks. Europe is a penumbra and flickering candle flames in small churches, white and gold opera halls, our cities, our small inns and pubs." Yet, more and more often, we do not recognize Europe at all. Entire districts of our cities resound with foreign languages, and the ringing of church bells has been replaced by the calls of a muezzin. As Giorgio Meotti writes, in Dutch Friesland alone, 250 of over 700 churches were transformed into something else or closed. According to recent research, almost half of Germans feel alien in their own country, Hans Georg confirms. The other half, they say, are Turks. Of those, vast majority say they feel comfortable in Germany, but more than half believe there is only one true religion, and that's Islam, and every third would like to return to life in the society of Muhammad's time. There are two lenses through which we can look at the consequences of such situation. The first one is purely societal. To understand it, let me invoke something that in the academic jargon is referred to as societal security. So one of the fundamental assumptions governing the societal security concept is that the state and the society of the same people are two different things. Society is more than just a state of the sector of a state security through which the state can be threatened. It becomes a referent object of its own security concerns, since societal identity is able to reproduce itself in spite of the state and even in opposition to it. Security of the state and security of a society are two different securities because they are derived from two different sources, the former from sovereignty, and the latter from patterns of language, culture, religious and national identities and customs. In short, society's security is defined by its identity and threats to it. Issues of culture underpin the possible threats and vulnerabilities. And processes that place us versus them, so situations where one identity is challenged by another, reinforce each other reciprocally and are of paramount importance. I am sure you immediately see how mass migration, especially in short period of time, is a potent trigger of societal insecurity. If we agree with this thesis, then we must remember that when different identities are mutually exclusive, or when one of them, by imposing its influence, interferes with reproduction of the other, that triggers a mechanism of protection against cultural transplantation. How should culture defend itself in such situation? When identity is threatened, its expression must be strengthened. Thus, culture becomes security policy until the symbolic and physical boundaries dividing communities are restored and strengthened enough for them to feel safe. So what do people do when they encounter such problems, which are a bit too big for them to solve in the local community? They turn to politics, obviously, hoping that their states will help, right? So let's look into the political dimension. We turn to political representation because in broadest terms, it means that when people are represented by their governments, it's possible to say that where the government rules, it is the people also who rule. And it doesn't matter what level analysis you'll take, representation always evolves around the issue of trust. To put it simply, people need to trust those who act for them politically. The trust is revocable, though, and can be withdrawn in case of breach. For instance, when such representative abuses their power or act in their self-interest or fail to bear the interest of those who they promised to represent. And when that trust is breached, the people turn to someone else. Who might that be, you ask? Well, it's the populist, of course. One of the classics who dealt with this problem already in 1950s, Edward Shales, defined populism precisely by this divide between the people and the elite. However, populism lost its credibility as a label. It is only employed as means of denying legitimacy. Think about it. The left versus right polarity attributes an equal legitimacy to both poles. Even if they have opposite political ideas, their system itself is based on the equal legitimacy of the two halves, the two poles, with uncertainty and gray zones represented by the fringes, so extreme right and extreme left. But the new mode is characterized by unequal legitimacy of the two poles or two halves. It's the mainstream and the populism, and populism is inherently legitimate in the eyes of the mainstream. And this new order is now imposing itself more and more upon us, and it rests on contrasts between legitimate opinions and then the illegitimate ones that can be cancelled, just like our conference. The new order is based on the polarity between orthodoxy and the heresy, and it turns out we are the heretics. All descent from establishment policies, from climate to integration to migration, of course, becomes populist or radical, or populist radical. We hear about radicals in politics all the time, but when you look at European migration policy, in hindsight, its introduction was nothing short of radical. Radical politics was defined by Anthony Giddens as breaking with the past while introducing and controlling such change. The form radicalism is the support of and commitment to bringing about a profound social, political, economic, or religious change and complete political and social transformation. And this is exactly what happened in Europe. We are in Brussels, right? So let's look at the local situation. In 1960, only 7.3% of population in Brussels was of foreign origin. The number has long exceeded 50%. And when huge waves of migrants began to arrive in the late 70s, the state stepped in. In 1974, Islam was officially recognized by the parliament. However, the legislation that gave it the status of official state religion was passed during the oil crisis and was accompanied by bilateral negotiations on oil supply agreements between Belgium and Saudi Arabia. So one might be tempted to say that this recognition was not really a response to real societal need. that it was a political calculation. And it did not reflect the place in the society that Belgian Muslims had at that time, because they were hidden at the outskirts. They did not really reside within the public activity. What makes this very important is that mass migration to Europe was born from the very beginning as an idea designed, developed, and implemented by the elites over the heads of citizens. With each subsequent step, the nations of Europe were told how inevitable and necessary progressive open border policy was, how it was invariably presented in the context of the widening and broadened, deepened community, understood as the ultimate goal and a primary goal. The Brussels elites strived to achieve a previously intended goal that has been decided for the good of its citizens, even if the citizens did not fully agree with that vision, in which case it was imposed anyway. Migration, and especially illegal migration, was important, but not the most important issue in the programs of European leaders until recently. The situation changed dramatically in 2015 when Angela Merkel promised shelter to anyone, just like Georg Maassen said. And nowadays what we see is that more and more people believe that a country unwilling to put the needs and interests of its own people first is not their country, and politicians unwilling to defend their voters, their social systems, laws, cultures, and borders are not really their politicians. The pro-immigration consensus at the elite level goes hand in hand with the anti-immigration dissent at the societal level. The European Union not only has no idea how to solve effectively the present situation concerning people who have already arrived at the continent, but also lacks long-term visions relating to the huge crowds of people numbering in millions already heading to Europe or planning to migrate. We can no longer talk about a cleavage, but we need to talk about a growing abyss between the political, the national, and the European elites and their societies. Societies have discovered that European Union officials, without consultations and, as it were, ex cathedra, announce decisions that bring potentially irreversible social changes, proclaiming that they are inevitable and that people can only adapt and get used to them. Moreover, it turns out that the political establishment in the European Union member states largely agrees to it. But while commissioners and high-level EU representatives are neither elected nor accountable to Europeans, national politicians no longer have that luxury. And societies that do not feel represented will look for new representation. So who they are going to turn to? Well, they turn to us. European societies have become, on the one hand, hostages of populist accusations, and on the other hand, victims of political correctness, which does not allow for open discussion about migration. The ban on statements that question the authorities' migration policies or evaluated negatively does not make the skepticism and social reluctance to disappear. On the contrary, these deepen and thicken in secret, while social tension increases as if in a corked bottle. There are two more points I want to make. Firstly, you are told you are populist when you oppose current migration policies. What I want to tell you is that you are not. You are the elite, the conservative elite, in a conservative meaning of that word, which means that you understand more, you look further than the closest electoral cycle. You look not 3 years ahead of time, but 30 years of time. And you look in generational, if not civilizational cycles. That is important, and that is something that an elite does, not a populist does. So my advice to all of you is, do not let yourself to be cornered into this populist narrative, so to speak. You are an elite, behave like one. And secondly, supporters of political entities not bound by identity or cultural boundaries, such as the EU, should be perhaps reminded of the words of one of their darlings, John Rawls, because he warned that, and I quote here, "Tearing down the walls of the state is not creating a world without walls, but rather creating a world in which there will be thousands of tiny fortresses." Thank you.